All right, to the phones we go, and we hook up with a noted writer and author who is kind enough to join us here on the Sportsline, Tom Callahan. Hi, Tom. How are you?
I'm grand. How about you?
Yeah, we're good. We're good. And you've got quite a storied career as a writer and now an author and doing some great stuff. And, we want to dive in on the books, but, despite the fact that this is kind of sort of a sports show, the debate last night, have you seen anything like that in your life?
No, it was disheartening in every way. I thought it was. I left it after about a half hour.
You couldn't do it, huh? I mean, not even the entertainment value could keep you around?
No.
Okay.
It was sad to me. And of course, Donald Trump has always made me sad. I was introduced to him at ringside of a fight years ago in Atlantic City. It was Tyson and Michael Spinks. And I had a cover story on the stands, Time magazine, on Mike Tyson. And Trump said to me, "Would you have any interest in writing my next book?" And I said to him, "I wouldn't have any interest in reading your."
Wow, what was the reaction there?
I was surprised, but I thought both of them kind of covered themselves, in coal dust.
Yeah, it seemed like there was really, and I said this earlier, it seemed like there was an opportunity for Biden to really take the high road, and then he just starts name calling and, just dives right in the gutter. It was crazy.
We have two guys coming up on 80. How can that be? Has it been so long since JFK said that, the torch has been passed to a younger generation? Now we keep passing this torch back to an older generation. I don't get it.
Yeah, a lot of people were definitely fed up with the debate last night. Let me ask you about your current book out, Tom, God's at Play. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's a function of having been watching games for 50 years. Adding up my memories, stories I've been telling forever and stories I've never told before. I discovered that the smaller memories are the ones that stay with you. I was present. I stood at the finish line for Secretariat's big races. I was in Africa for Ali's fight. I went to 30 some Super Bowls and Masters and British Opens, but the grand tally, it's all the littlest things. I'll give you an example. In 1972. The World Series was in Cincinnati, and Jackie Robinson was on the field before Game 2. And, of course, the black players, the Oakland A's and the Cincinnati Reds, they circled him. They just wanted to touch him. Everybody but Joe Morgan, little second baseman for the Reds. And now the message comes over the PA for the non-uniform personnel to get off the field. And Morgan goes up behind Robinson. I was kind of fascinated watching him. And he walks up behind Robinson, and he doesn't say, "This is Joe Morgan." He simply says in a voice so low, I had to lean in to hear him, "Thank you."
Wow.
And Robinson, without turning around, said, "You're welcome." And I followed Jackie into the Reds dugout and up the ramp to the clubhouse where Jim Murray of the L.A. Times was standing. "Jackie, it's Jim Murray," he said. And Robinson said, "Oh, Jim. Oh, Jim, I wish I could see you again." And Murray said, "No, Jackie, I wish we could see you again." Well, I can't tell you the score of the game that day, but I'll never forget that exchange. And that's all this book is. It's just the smallest stories of a guy who was lucky enough to be standing around for a lot of big events.
You've done a number of books. Written a number of books, obviously, about lots of great events in golf and some bigger and some smaller. How do you decide which ones you're going to wind up writing?
It was funny. These stories decided for me. I happened to be the last guy to talk to Roberto Clemente at his locker, at his final locker. Of course, neither one of us knew it was his final locker, but that season ended on, of all things, a wild pitch. The Reds beat the Pittsburghs. And And I didn't want to go into the Cincinnati side because I didn't want to get doused in champagne. And so I went to the losers' locker room, and all the other writers went with the winners. And so I had Clemente to myself, and it was so no credit to me. It was a complete accident. I befriended Arthur Ashe. I was at a Wimbledon, and somebody introduced me to him, and he said, "I not only know Tom Callahan, we're great adversaries." I was writing a column for the Washington Star, and he contributed columns to the Washington Post, and so we became friends. We became crossword puzzle friends, and no trip was too far to go, no premium too high to pay to get a Sunday New York Times in London. And during the year he'd call me up and we'd talk about a lot of things. He called me once laughing, saying, "Have you heard from the mayor of Biloxi yet?" I had written a column on John Thompson, the Georgetown basketball coach, whose team had taken the Hoyas to the Final Four in New Orleans, and he took them to Mississippi an hour and a half away because he didn't trust them in the French Quarter. And so anyway, I wrote, "He's the only black man who ever moved to Biloxi for peace of mind." And Ash and I were, I loved him, and one of the most heartbreaking things that ever happened to me in sports. Of course, I knew he had HIV. Frank DeFord, great old writer for the Sports Illustrated in those days, was a terrific friend of Ash's, and he asked Arthur if he could tell me, that Arthur had AIDS, and he gave me permission. He said yes. So I knew a couple of years before he made his horrible announcement in New York. He had to call a press conference because USA Today was threatening to make a scoop out of it, and he begged them not to, but he knew he was losing the argument. So after he gave this touching speech in New York, a bunch of us went down to him, and my old crossword puzzle friend, and Arthur grabbed me by the elbow and he pulled me aside and he whispered in my ear, "I want to be buried 6 down and 4 across." and how can you avoid writing things like that?
Tom, I know you've done a lot of great books on like Tiger Woods, Johnny Unitas, other major sports figures. Who's one that you would love to interview or write a book about that you haven't yet?
I'm not going to write any more books. I'm 74 years old, but I don't know. I'm not sure if I could put my finger on one. The most compelling figure I ever encountered in sports was Muhammad Ali, by far. He said the same thing to me every time he saw me. "How's Angie? I like her better than you." and he never met her. I was on the phone with him once, desperate to get away because deadline was bearing down on me, and so I handed Angie the phone, and I went in the next room, wrote a column, came back in the room an hour and a half later, and they were still talking. And when I was in Africa, of course, I picked Foreman, and students of my picks over the years won't be surprised to hear that. But I picked the wrong guy, and I'm in this hacienda in Encelli, which is where all the writers stayed for the fight. And Ali came in, and he looked at the betting sheet on the wall and saw Foreman and a 1, and he turned around and he waved me, "Come outside." And the two of us went out into the dark, blacker than half past midnight. We had to hold on to each other to make our way to the Congo River. There was so little light. And we got there, and he said to me, "I'm going to tell you something. I don't want you ever to forget it. Black men scare white men more than black men scare black men." And, of course, that was true. We were afraid. And I said to him, "Aren't you even a little afraid?" And he said, "A little fear is good." He said, I need my fear. I can't do without my fear." And I said, "Well, Angelo Dundee told me this is the most uptight he's ever seen you." And Ali said, my entire destiny is at stake here." I guess I could have written a book about him and enjoyed doing it, But he, as I say, he was in the latter days when he was lost, and when he could break your heart. I was in a car with him once, and Bill Mack, my great friend, a writer, and old boxing writer from Newsday had just died, a guy named Bob Waters, who I knew Ali loved because I saw him sneak up behind him once and kiss him on the top of his pink head. And so anyway, Mack said, "Champ, do you remember Bob Waters?" And Ali said, "Vaguely." He had that horrible voice like a guy with an artificial larynx. And I said to him, "Well, at least you remember the word vaguely." And he tried to laugh, but I have to admit, I didn't want to fall in love with any of the athletes, but I couldn't help myself with Ali.
Who is the most misunderstood rather? Who is the most misunderstood athlete that you really got to know that would, you'd have a story either maybe positively or negatively that would really surprise folks?
I had both positive and negative with Pete Rose. He could be very sweet. He could be incredibly coarse and wrong and stupid, but he could be incredibly sweet. And the first time I ever saw him, I came into Cincinnati to work for the Cincinnati Enquirer. That was my second paper. I was quite young, and I went over to Riverfront. They had a businessman special. And the game was over in early afternoon, and Rose was back on the field taking batting practice from a great old guy named George Sugar, who was Sparky Anderson's first minor league skipper. And there was only one other player out there. It was George Foster, young left fielder, who had been sent down to AAA the moment the game ended, and he didn't want to take off his uniform. So he's leaning on one side of the cage, and I'm leaning on the other. And Rose is hitting, and it's comical watching Rose taking batting practice because every few pitches he screams, "I could hit on Christmas Day," and he's so full of himself. But eventually he turned to me and said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm Callahan, the new man at the Enquirer." He said, "I heard you. They say you've come to bring journalism to Cincinnati." and then he turns to Foster before I can say anything to that, and he says, You want to hit some?" And Foster said, "If you've got him," very quietly. And Pete says, "I've got him as long as you want him." So Rose pulls off his shirt, goes to the mound, starts throwing to Foster. And Foster takes him a while to kind of time Pete's strange delivery. And Pete yells at him, "Here comes my curve." And he did have kind of a curve, and Foster hit it into the left field bleachers. and so Pete walked halfway down from the rubber home plate, and he said, in the gentlest voice, so unlike him, he said, "You'll be back, kid. I'll wait for you." He said, "And I'll make you a promise that I'll never go to the bathroom when you're at bat, because something great is coming, and I don't want to miss it." And of course, Foster went on to hit 52 home runs with a 149 RBI and named the most valuable player in the National League.
Talking about Pete Rose, Tom, should he be in the Hall of Fame?
No, I don't think so. I don't care, to be honest with you, because when you've got more hits than anybody else ever had, you don't need the sports writers to vote on whether you belong in the Hall of Fame. And I've told Rose this, because he said to me, "You're going to vote for me, aren't you?" And I said, I stopped voting on things like that 10 years ago. But to me, the biggest crime, they keep saying he committed the biggest crime. The biggest crime is to bet against yourself and fix the bet. Make sure you lost. He bet on his teams to win, his two teams, Cincinnati and Philadelphia. That's why he lost so much money. He was a sentimental better, and he was. I should have caught on to it because he talked about gambling incessantly when I knew him. He talked about, but numbers were everything to him. I sat in a dugout with him once, and Phil Niekro, the old knuckleball pitcher, he's running in the outfield, and Pete turns to me and he says, "I got 71 hits off Phil Niekro." And he says, "I got 41 hits off Joe Niekro." Damn, I wish Mrs. Niekro had another. And there's a certain kind of, it kind of makes you sad when you're around somebody that single faceted, I always knew where I could get him late at night if I needed a quote. He was sitting in the driveway in his car listening to the Dodger game on the only radio he had that could bring in Vin Scully. He was that single faceted. And his first wife told me once she was like the female Pete Rose, very sweet and very very loud. And Carolyn, and she said to me once, "You and I should write a book. We could call it The Wife of the Switch Hitter." She said, but she told me once there was never a night, never a morning when I didn't see Pete at the kitchen table working out his averages. She said he the reason he failed in our marriage, I believe, is he never grew up. Well, I kind of agree with that too. He never grew up, and but I'll tell you what. And I told him this because he invited me to listen to him give a speech once to the rookie league kids when he was the manager, and they're all being assigned to instructional leagues. And so he gave this great talk, saying how he could see himself in them and how they were great and this and how they're all going to have great careers, blah blah blah. Don't forget, he said, I'm the same as anyone here who has 2 arms, 2 legs, and 4,250 hits. Well, if you've got 4,256 hits, you don't need to have Murray Chass of the New York Times say you were a good player.
Tom Callahan, new book, latest book, last book, Gods at Play, an eyewitness account, available for sale wherever you buy books, Amazon, other places. Tom,
buy it. Don't buy it. It'll be free in the library. I don't write for money anymore. I write purely for love, and so I'd love it if people read it. But it's free. It's in the library. Go, don't order it.
Okay. Never heard anyone say that before. Thank you.
That's pretty good, Tom. Thanks for your time, Tom.
Hey, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Appreciate it. Tom Callahan.